Hello, podcast family. I'm thrilled and humbled to be in the virtual studio today with Rachel Farrell. Rachel is a genetic counselor who cares for children with inherited cardiovascular diseases resulting from genetic mutations. Rachel earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and Hispanic studies from Lewis and Clark College, and then earned her master's degree in human genetics and genetic counseling from Stanford University. Rachel has a very unique perspective on grief. While Rachel hasn't experienced the death of someone directly close to her, she is what I would like to call a grief companion, as someone who interacts with grief and grieving families on a daily basis. Given her work and her clinical background, I wanted to have her on as a specialist to talk about her work, something I didn't even know was available when my family was going through my dad's sudden loss. Personally, Rachel and I were connected through a very close mutual friend, and I'm grateful she wanted to join us on the Currency of Grief podcast. So without further ado, hello, podcast family. I am thrilled and honored to be in the virtual studio today with Rachel Farrell. Rachel is a genetic counselor who cares for children with inherited cardiovascular diseases resulting from genetic mutations. Rachel earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and Hispanic studies from Lewis and Clark College, and then her master's degree in human genetics and genetic counseling from Stanford University. Rachel has a very unique perspective on the currency of grief, and that's why I asked her to join us today on the podcast. I met Rachel through my professional life and through an introduction from a very dear friend of both of ours. And I'm honored and just grateful to have you on the podcast today, Rachel. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. And you have a unique perspective on, like I said, your relationship with grief and the currency of grief. And I was just super excited to have you on and facilitate this conversation for our audience today.
Me too. I think the connections we've made through our professional relationship have led the way to this, opening up avenue for this conversation.
Perfect. Amazing. And so your relationship with grief, like I alluded to, is a little unique. So here in the Currency of Grief, we don't hold back. We dive right in immediately to the deep stuff. So tell us a little bit about your professional and personal relationship with grief.
Yeah. So I encounter grief almost every day through my work. I'm a pediatric genetic counselor in our pediatric heart center. So I work specifically in cardiovascular genetics, where I work with a lot of families that have experienced grief through a sudden death. Mainly that's a parent or a sibling or child. And in those cases, I help the family navigate all of the aftermath regarding genetic testing and evaluation to help determine if we can find a reason for their loved one's passing.
That must be a very unique and deep topic conversation. Takes a certain type of person to be able to guide someone through that.
Yeah, I think it's really, my job involves, it's really an intersection of kind of knowing the nitty gritty of all of the genetics, all the nuances that are involved with having to coordinate the logistics of this testing, but also having an understanding of the family's lived experience, what they're going through, what they may go through. I tend to guide these families for months on end, sometimes a year or two is how long this process takes. So I think it is, like you said, a very unique kind of mixture of skills that are involved to help help families through this journey.
And the grief process really never ends, but you allow them, from our previous conversations, to find a little bit of clarity in the grief. Some people die and they never know how or why. And some people are searching for answers. me personally, I went through this whole what if I was there? What if my dad didn't smoke cigarettes or would ran a marathon? Like, would this have happened? And I think, I mean, it sounds like your role in these families' lives is to provide them that clarity and guidance and help them through probably the toughest time of their
Mhm.
life.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. There's so many questions that go through a loved one's mind following an event like this. I mean, it's human, right? You can't help but try to figure out the why.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what I do is it's a small piece of the pie. It really isn't the whole. It's not the whole thing, but I think that for me at least, helping the family determine if there could be an answer genetically not only has implications for their loved one that passed, but for all of the surviving individuals, because life still goes on for them, right? Even though
Yeah.
life stopped for that loved one, and it sometimes feel like time has stopped after you've lost such an important person, that life still goes on, and our medical knowledge has equipped us at this point in time so incredibly to be able to um, try to mitigate any health risks that might have come about because of this genetic etiology. So it's a small thing that I could provide to the family in the midst of a huge cataclysmic change.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of maybe when or why or
Mhm.
how somebody would come to you and work with you?
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I'm quite hard to find because I am so embedded within my hospital, within the medical system, and so I do want
Well,
to acknowledge.
I'm glad we got you out of the lab
Yeah,
behind the
yeah.
screens onto the podcast studio, you know?
I'm emerging. But yeah, yeah, I want to acknowledge just how hard it is to just navigate even a basic appointment with your primary care physician, let alone somebody that could do this type of very rare genetic testing. But for example, I can give just an example from my experience. Have a family whose there were multiple children, and one of the children became ill actually at an amusement park, and subsequently passed away very suddenly, so extremely suddenly, within um, almost minutes. Extremely devastating situation, especially when the loved one is a minor. And so, in this situation, the living siblings were evaluated by a cardiologist, which is one of the kind of first things we recommend. If there are surviving siblings or surviving first degree relatives, it's always an important thing to check their heart and make sure that there's nothing that can be caught right then and there. And then, it's really I just kudos to my cardiology team, because they're really the ones that identify my patients. They're the ones that do the evaluations and then send them to me if they deem that the family could benefit from genetic testing. And in this situation, it's so time sensitive, because if there are viable samples that can be used, then I can work with the corresponding medical examiner or coroner's office to then be able to coordinate genetic testing. So that's kind of one of the main routes that patients get to me, so that I can help coordinate their testing.
Hmm. So it sounds like the process is um, they would go get tested from a cardiologist first,
Mhm.
and then you would work, they would then, the cardiologist would then identify something, make some sort of either introduction or referral to your hospital, and then they would work with you to get, or that you would kind of further the testing with your, I guess, advanced technology and degrees and stuff like that. So what is that? Is that accurate? And can you go a little bit more in depth as to like the
Mhm.
process?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I'm at a big academic hospital, and we have multiple satellite clinics. And I'm talking to you from the Bay Area, from San Francisco, and so we have multiple clinics all over the area, and so it's really, I almost think of it as kind of like an octopus with all these arms that are reaching to then be able to refer to me, the one person that can kind of do this testing. So that's absolutely right in terms of the process. What's helpful is that if there is a surviving sibling with any physical signs on a cardiac evaluation, that's really going to help determine genetic testing for that individual. So then we would sort of jump to doing testing for that individual. But for parents that have lost one of their children recently, to know that the hearts of all of their surviving children look good. And that's usually the case. Usually we don't find things in the surviving siblings right then and there. That's extremely reassuring for the family. And then that helps me determine, okay, well, we're going to focus our energies on the formal word for an individual that has passed away is called a decedent. So that's kind of the term that I use, when we're talking about genetic testing, and I'm coordinating with the coroner's office to make sure that there's samples from the decedent that we could use. And in the situation that I just explained about the family that I worked with, doing genetic testing would help us determine the risks for the surviving siblings and the parents. And there were very specific findings in her autopsy exam that would have been corroborated or not by the genetic testing. So kind of just, again, lending to the expertise that we need with regard to cardiology and genetics is really important, because we're working with such a precious sample. It's like we have one shot to do this and do this right, and that's it.
So it really takes an expert to do this type of testing. And so are there a lot of other people out there like you and your team?
Not a ton. The field of genetic counseling is still about 50 years old. So just in terms of the field itself, it's quite it's still quite in its infancy. And then all of the subspecialties within my profession are even newer. And so cardiology, cardiovascular genetics is one of those. So I would say, in order to find, I know that there's a group at Stanford that does similar testing, and then a couple other academic centers, around the country, a smattering. We're tiny but mighty, and I think you need the expertise, but you also kind of need the tenacity, because it's a lot of trying to get through to a lot of these offices and get the testing it takes a lot of heavy lifting. But it's totally worth it if we're able to get a shot at, getting an answer for our families.
So it sounds like you provide the answers to families to make sure that the survivors the siblings, the other family members who have the same genetics and DNA, their hearts look good. They're able to function, and they don't have to worry about. And if they were to reproduce, like one of our other guests, the Romer family, they had to go through genetic testing to make sure that they were okay to have more kids after the death of one of their kids from a genetic disease. And so this gives these families peace of mind.
100%. Yeah. The one caveat with genetic testing is that we may not find an answer necessarily through the genetic test. The yield for postmortem genetic testing is when you really think about it, it's quite low. It's somewhere in the order of about 10 to 15%. So I do tell my families this, but what is really important, like you said, just in terms of making sure their hearts look good, is that even if we don't find a genetic reason, they're already plugged into what we call surveillance, which is getting kind of either annual or biannual checkups of the heart as the children or the other survivors age. And so even if we don't find a genetic reason, we know that we can still find things on a cardiac exam that will help mitigate risks moving forward. in the event we find something, I mean, that's that whenever I get a result like that and I'm able to tell a family, this is it, I can't even explain the feeling that I get. It's like, it makes me so happy. It's a double-edged sword sometimes, just because we find something doesn't mean that the family's going to be happy. They've gone through so much. Sometimes, there's sort of the whiplash of then the guilt of potentially, the other relatives that also have this variant, the guilt of having passed on this genetic variant. But it allows not only for, like you mentioned, reproductive um, genetic testing to see what the recurrence risk is in future pregnancies, but it also allows us to do something we call predictive testing. So testing unaffected relatives, so the unaffected surviving children. And some children don't carry the variant, so then they're not at risk for that genetic problem. So it almost exempts some relatives from having to do the screening. So there's a lot involved with either finding or not finding a genetic result, but my job is to guide the family through what the recommendations are, regardless of what the outcome is.
Mm. Yeah, I think, well, I want to take a step back. So, your situation, your relationship with grief is unique because personally, you haven't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
experienced the direct loss of a sibling or
Mm-hmm.
a child or
Mm-hmm.
a spouse or a parent or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
With that said, you experience the grief through your patients and the
Mm-hmm.
families that you work with,
Mm-hmm.
and you help them, guide them to find answers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of ironic, but there are happy moments even as you are grieving,
Mm-hmm.
and moments of clarity, which is, I said it in the intro. um and it sounds like when you find an answer through genetic testing, and it makes you happy, and sometimes makes the families happier, or that they have peace of mind. And so describe that feeling. I know not every genetic test comes with results or positive results,
Mm-hmm.
but describe that feeling of like the happiness that comes with that peace of mind.
Yeah, for me, I think it's instantaneous because I sometimes think of my job as sort of being like a director or producer. You're doing so much behind the scenes, especially for my families that are in situations where I'm coordinating postmortem testing. I tell them up front, I'm going to call the coroner's office. I'm going to do all the logistics. I'll let you know. I kind of give them like a little soundbite of the progress moving forward, but I'm not going to tell them all the nitty gritty. I think that one of the gifts I can give my families is to try to do some of that heavy lifting for them. They're doing so much themselves that, they don't need to know that I made 10 phone calls to the coroner's office or it's taken me 2 months, to get through to somebody that can help me. I don't want them to worry. I think that anxiety can be so high for families, especially following the event, that I just want to give them very concrete answers. And so for me, when I get a result like that, it's almost instantaneous because I know all the work that went into getting this result. And then I set up a meeting with the family to go over the result at a time that's convenient for them. I also am very cognizant that parents know their children the best. So a lot of times, the parent or parents want to hear the results prior to letting their family or their children know. So we set up, a meeting to go over those things. And sometimes the families are a bit in shock. I think that uh, it takes a moment to have things settle in, and especially good news when you've been so used to just sort of closing off a little bit and keeping your heart protected. And so, if families don't have that immediate joy that I feel having found this answer, I know that it'll just take time because there's so much that they're processing. They're like, now
Yeah.
I know why. What do we do next? So giving families time for the information to kind of settle is really key. So a lot of times they'll have multiple follow-up conversations even after I give the initial news. Sometimes I give the news and that's it, lights out. They need to just shut it down, and I'll call them in a couple of days and go over
Hmm.
logistics.
Yeah, that's interesting and important, and like, yeah, when you experience that loss and you get news of any kind, sorry, excuse me, you get news of any kind, you really don't know how to feel. And sometimes the emotions, I mean, you've said it in the past in our conversations, like you're numb to those emotions and it takes time for it to sink in. And so for me, and my example is when I looked at my dad's autopsy report, and my dad died of a heart attack. I immediately, not immediately, but it took me a while to think about my own life. And I was like, all right, I should go see a cardiologist and get checked out. So I went to a cardiologist in Delray Beach, Florida. I was the youngest one in there by 60 years, and got the EKG and did all the heart tests. And for me personally, that's how I was plugged into surveillance. Is at the age of 22 years old, I went in and met with a cardiologist and built that relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's exactly, yeah, you're exactly, um, it's the same process as my patients.
Yeah.
But I think you really identified a really important experience for our patients. It's that it's the sort of the temporal piece of all of this, the time. It just it's very warped, and I think that yeah, when you have something shocking has happened to you, and then you get news that's also a little bit, can be shocking, that you can't process everything. And in fact, everything from then on, I know sometimes families can't even absorb more information from that. So I'll gauge, and I think it's important to gauge and just know when there's, it's just time to kind of let things settle and not overwhelm the family with more information.
Yeah. What's the hardest or like most unexpected thing that you either families have to deal with immediately after the loss? Is that it,
Mm.
or are there other things?
I mean, I think, yeah, I think it's so hard to navigate. You just feel so out of control. You don't know, your loved one is in a different physical space. You have no autonomy or agency over even, their physicality anymore. I think that piece is really hard, but at least I can kind of step in. Um, I know, I mean, exactly what you're doing. I know that the financial piece, just following, a catastrophic event like a sudden death of a loved one, is so hard to navigate. I've heard it. I've had families explain it to me as kind of a slap in the face, where all of a sudden, they need to make funeral arrangements, and they need to log into their loved one's accounts, and it's hard to even get a password for for their Gmail or for the bank if you've had shared bank accounts, and then all the stress around losing, if there's if your spouse is the one that's past, losing the income of that spouse. I know for me, um, uh, I'm really cognizant of that, and I try to be as transparent with my families about the cost of genetic testing, because it's no longer covered by insurance, and that's kind of
Mm,
a slap in the face too. So um, I know that is extremely difficult. And then, the kids still need to go to school. The kids still need things. It's like there's no pause button for life when something like this happens. It's so
yeah.
it can feel like a slap in the face, like I said.
So it's so yeah. I didn't even know this resource even existed. Like I didn't know you like what genetic testing even was when my dad died. That wasn't even something that I had thought about. I
Mm-hmm.
was just thinking about picking up the pieces of our life because everything changed after I got that call. And so, who has access to you?
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like genetic testing could cost a lot. And you just mentioned it's not covered by insurance. So, do you need millions and trillions of dollars to get tested, like genetic testing done?
So it depends on the testing that one does. The uh, if you do more targeted testing, so again, the importance of looking at an autopsy, looking at the family history, looking to see if there's any physical findings on any survivors, cardiac evaluations, that helps us determine the type of testing. So just to give you numbers, because I know you're a numbers guy, Justin, more targeted testing, meaning uh, like a handful of genes on a panel. And to give you kind of context, we have 20,000 genes in the body,
That's
but
it.
there's just 20,000. And the genes that we can test for in more of a targeted way are about 100. So,
Oh, wow.
and the price of that now at commercial labs is $250. So that's, for some families that could be cost prohibitive, but it's, not, most families can pull together that amount of money.
Mhm.
What gets trickier is when we do more expanded testing, when we don't think that there's going to be fantastic coverage on that 100 gene panel. We need to expand. And so you can imagine we're dealing with a very small amount of blood, 3 cc's, 5 cc's, and we have one shot a lot of times. And, sometimes we're not even able to amplify the DNA because of how it was stored, or, maybe the DNA is about a year old. So if we do more expanded testing, now we're able to actually look at all 20,000 genes and beyond. Sometimes we're able to look sort of outside of the main gene region, look sort of at the non-coding regions. That testing could be upwards of about $3,000. So it increases by over a magnitude of 10. And that amount certainly can be cost prohibitive for some of my families. I work at a public hospital and we take all comers. So, again, I mentioned sort of the financial hit from losing a spouse. That can be a lot for families to take on. So that's not fun. I hate having that conversation, but I never want families. I'm never not going to offer something to a family because of my assumption that they may or may not be able to afford something. And I also never want my families to be blindsided with, some huge
Cost
bill, that
increase.
some cost, that they didn't anticipate. But that's just to kind of give you a sense of the numbers behind it all.
Yeah. And so I just had a conversation with somebody else and they were like, oh, I hate when creditors continue to call you, or realtors, or whatever it is, people who are preying on people and they want your money and they want access, or they want to sell your property or something. So I appreciate your transparency when it comes to the fees and the delicateness that um, that comes with it. When you talk about genetic testing, what are some of maybe the pitfalls? Like, should everybody get genetic testing after the death of a loved one?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. I specifically do genetic testing when autopsy findings are indicative of a inherited cardiovascular condition. So sometimes, we'll review the autopsy and, there's some other indication, maybe there was something lethal in their blood system, and that's really the cause of their dying, or it was a COVID-19 infection. And so, I never, I tell families that, especially after losing their loved one, it's just a natural human process where we sort of jump to a conclusion about potential cause of death. And so, because our sample is so precious and we have to be so thoughtful about the testing we do, I really have to defer to the medical examiner. And so once we get the autopsy report, which can take months and months to get the final report, that's really what guides us. And so I would say autopsy findings, and then age. So, the age at which somebody passes. We typically say that a young sudden death is somewhere between the age of 40 to 45 or younger. And so it's kind of a conglomeration of lots of different suspicious factors. I think that because of the time involved and just how, the resources involved, it wouldn't make sense for all individuals to do genetic testing. But in a situation where there's been a sudden unexplained death, um, it is really helpful to do the genetic testing. And I will say that there are a subset of inherited cardiovascular conditions that are not detectable through autopsy. So if an individual has a problem with their heart rhythm, you can't see a heart and know that they might have a lethal arrhythmia. So that is a situation where, and there's certain circumstances too that might lead us to think that it was an arrhythmic death, where we can then check that subset of arrhythmia genes that are included on the 100 gene panel. But like, even as I'm talking through it, it's very nuanced, right? You have to kind of know, and there are some protocols, but again, you really have to kind of congeal all the information. And I have a clinical team too that I always bounce all of these cases off of, so that we work together and we really figure out what the best plan is moving forward for them.
So it sounds like you defer to the medical examiner for the most part on the autopsy report, but specifically sudden unexplained death cases for a decedent who's under the age of 45, or potential arrhythmia genes that want to be tested for, those are like the people who should get potentially genetic testing if they have the resources and the means.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And if they're, are surviving children, if the genetic information would benefit survivors, and in most cases it does, then that's definitely reason to, I've done testing for, for parents that are over the age of 45. But again, there were suspicious circumstances around their passing. Maybe they were, they died while exercising or doing something strenuous where they were exerting their heart. Those are kind of the suspicious circumstances that, are important to evaluate. And that's included too in the ME's report, so I'll be able to, the family will always report to me what happened, but sometimes they don't know. And so again, not only the pathology findings are important, but sort of the circumstances surrounding, their passing. It's kind of all comes together to help us figure out what the best strategy is moving forward.
An ME, medical examiner. Did I get that right?
Yep, you got it. Look, yeah.
I could join the medical field, maybe. No, I'll stick to my day job, podcast hosting. Rachel, you seem like I know you personally, but you're an incredibly nice person, sweet, kind, genuine. And so why this career? Like, this seems like a very difficult career.
I know.
Why this career? Yeah, let's start there.
Well, I thank you for those kind words. It's kind of evolved over time. I never, I've been kind of like board certified genetic counselor since 2013. So that's 12 years now. And I didn't, this is not, a fresh out of graduate school role typically that one would take. So, so I've kind of evolved. I did a prenatal specialty before joining in cardiovascular genetics in the pediatric heart center. And so my relationship to families that are going through tough times, going through, having to make really important medical decisions, I've learned, I've seen thousands of patients over the course of 12 years. And before that I trained. So, so you have this comfortability with it, like just like you probably have comfortability talking about numbers. I know you do, because I've talked to you a lot about numbers and money. Whereas, sometimes, I can feel uncomfortable with those topics, but because of your exposure and just doing it so much, you just develop this sort of ease around things. And it doesn't mean that when I talk to my families, I'm not nervous sometimes, or, I don't feel uncomfortable, but I try to check it and just kind of put it in a place where then I can kind of put my genetics hat on and guide the family. And once I do that, once I kind of the initial kind of nervousness will wear off. But I really get so much fulfillment from just working with families when, they're at a time where they're just need that guidance and they feel lost, and to be able to just help them a little bit through a really difficult time for me is just very rewarding.
Yeah, it unfortunately is. I know that from our work at experience camp, seeing a kid come off the bus with their hood up, and they don't want to talk to anyone. They don't want to mention their person's name, to the end of the week where they're running around the soccer field, kicking the ball around with their new best friends, and they feel comfortable sharing at a campfire, um, and opening up about their person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it takes a certain, like I said earlier, a certain type of person with that genuine, gentle feel like yourself to guide someone through this process. And so was there anything about your background or your journey through medicine and grief that allowed, like, gave you these skills besides just experience to help people, guide people through your line,
Yeah.
the genetic testing and postmortem death cases?
Yeah. I did a very impactful rotation during my graduate training where I shadowed chaplains at Stanford Hospital. So of all different denominations. So I shadowed a rabbi, I shadowed a priest, I shadowed a Buddhist monk. And so we would be bedside, either at the time of, right when somebody passed away to be with the family, or right beforehand. And it was a 5-week rotation, and I've never cried more in my life. And I'm not afraid to cry. So this was like waterworks every single day. And I think it almost like broke the barrier for me. Where I just was so close to death and dying. And I saw it was so hard for the families, but I really saw just how these families came together and got the support, and just how, even how beautiful that process was, and that how lucky these family members were to even be bedside with their loved ones. It just was so eye-opening for me. And to have that exposure so early on, I mean, that was in like 2010, 2011.
Wow.
And that was elective, believe it or not. So I actually asked to do something, and they're like, fine, Rachel, you can shadow the chaplains. Good luck. And I could not believe it. And then I remember one of my classmates did the same thing. And he said, we're crazy for doing this. And I said, I know. Well, you're crazy for following me to do this, but it still sticks with me. And so, because I'm fortunate, I haven't had, like you mentioned at the top of the podcast, a personal experience with a sudden death of a very close relative. I just have had, I was lucky enough to have some of that exposure. So I think that really informed me, and gave me that comfortability with the topic, to then, almost 15 years later, to now be working alongside families, where they've lost their loved one suddenly, and then to be able to apply my genetics knowledge is just, for me, such a synchronous kind of meeting up of events.
That's so funny. Yeah, for me, it's death and money, and creating more fulfilled lives out of that. These conversations. And you mentioned you were lucky to have this experience where you shadowed the chaplains, even though your counselors, your academic counselors, were like, what is does she know what she's in for? You're literally signing up to cry your eyes out and be with people during their worst times.
Yeah, just the small moments, and how just, yeah. And just being able to be there, it's such an intimate experience. And I mean, I was like, felt like a fly on the wall, but I soaked up so much, probably saw dozens and dozens of families that were there. And what's so incredible is that, I mentioned I was shadowing chaplains of all different denominations, but there's this kind of single thread, right? Like through every single person, no matter who they are, that it's going to happen to all of us. And it's, there's just kind of just this universality of those last moments. And, we all kind of do it the same. It's all like very similar emotions. So for me, it just kind of reminds me of our humanity and just really how connected and similar we all are.
Yeah. Did that rotation and does your work shift the way you view your life?
Mm-hmm.
Like, has it changed your perspective on death, money, or legacy?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no way that you could do what I do and not have it, especially if you're integrating the information and you're trying to be empathic to patients. In a healthy way, you take on some of the experience to be able to connect with the families. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's just, it would be unnatural if I didn't. I think the most important thing that I have learned is just to appreciate the small moments. It's my families tell me, it's not our wedding day. Well, for some, maybe it was the wedding day, but it's not the big events. It's like, the coffee that we drank together in the morning, 5 minutes before we had to cart the kids off to school, or, that couch, the couch that's right in the window where the sun hits, like that he or she would sit. It's just those small, it's the small things really that those kind of everyday things that I try to not take for granted, because you just never know. It's like you just never know when something like this might hit. So I think a lot of gratitude, appreciation for what I have, the small moments, because you just never know when something might happen, might hit.
I'm going to push you a little bit. Is there one small thing, small moment that you've learned to appreciate over your career in this
Yeah.
field?
Yeah. I think my relationships, really, with my spouse who with Eric. And I think, too, how close I am with my family. I'm one of 5 sisters. I think your relationships, they say determine, the quality of life and your happiness. And so that's something that just gets so amplified when you lose a loved one, right? If there were rifts in the relationship, that gets amplified times a million because you can no longer repair those things. And if, you did have a good relationship, that also gets amplified too. That grief can be even bigger. Sometimes they say, I've heard this, and I would agree that, kind of the magnitude of someone's grief a lot of times is reflective of how much you loved that person. So sometimes, someone may feel the most grief if they just, if that love was just so deep. And so for me, yeah, just fostering those relationships, because, once I'm gone, it's up to everyone around me, all the survivors, to hopefully say good things about me or remember me in a good way. And that takes a lifetime of building. You don't just, buy someone a gift and they're going to say nice things about you once you die. It's really a process and a daily practice. So yeah, my relationships are, at the top.
Yeah. Warren Buffett has this quote that's, write your obituary and live every day to it.
Yeah.
And your obituary, unless you literally do write your own, is typically written by your loved ones, the people closest to you. So really translating that a little bit is write down how you want to be remembered and then live every day to it. And you mentioned some rifts in a relationship, or even some people across the country that have grown distant. Maybe it's just picking up the phone and calling that person.
Yeah.
Those are some of those small moments.
100%. Yeah. And you never know what somebody's going through. And I know with my families, sometimes they were feeling symptoms. I think you mentioned with your father kind of going through all of the different scenarios in your head, picking up the phone and yeah, just checking in on someone. Just you never know, right? It can impact someone in a way that that may make a difference or not. But I think yeah, just doing what you can each day just to kind of keep relationships intact and moving forward, because we are so spread out now around the world, and people keep their head down and they keep going. But I think my families have really taught me that it's important just to take stock, take time out, and reach out when you can.
So I'm going to challenge podcast family here. If you're listening to this, pause the recording, pause the podcast, go call someone you love, call someone you care about, tell them you love them.
Yeah.
Fix the riff in the relationship you may have with someone you care about, and then press play and continue listening to this episode, please. We'd appreciate hearing the rest of Rachel's story. And I want to bring up a topic regarding your clinical background. From our conversations, it's helped teach you how to communicate around and with people who are going through grief and the bereaved. And so what are some of the things that you see in society that are maybe misconceptions, or how are people feeling who are grieving? And then what are some skills, tactics that maybe you haven't lost someone, but maybe someone in your life has lost someone and you want to be there for them? What are the things that you could do, things to say? How do you navigate that?
I'm really glad you brought this up. It's almost speak kind of just from anecdotal experience. I know that once, when a family's gone through something so cataclysmic like this, they just want to be heard. I think there's nothing that you or I could say to a friend or a loved one that's gone through something like this that's going to take any of their pain away. So I know sometimes we try to think of the one thing that might just, momentarily make them feel better. There's nothing that we can say. I think there's so much power in just being with someone and holding that space, holding that silence, and letting them talk if they want to talk, letting them cry if they want to cry, letting them stare at a wall, but holding their hand or just being next to them. Your world is upside down. So you're not, you're not eating, you're not sleeping, your world's upside down. So I think the normal things that you would do for a friend, that, where maybe they had a bad day, that's not going to apply to somebody that's been through something like this. And one other thing that I've heard patients say to me is that, to not say like platitudes. So this happens for a reason, or, there's a silver lining. I think that that actually does more harm and could maybe, because it's almost undermining their pain and their loss, because maybe you're feeling uncomfortable. So you're trying to take away that discomfort. But it can actually do more harm than good, because they may feel kind of closed off to then sharing something with you because of this thing that didn't feel very genuine. So sometimes just not saying anything at all, but just being there physically with somebody is so helpful, especially in the kind of moments really subsequent to the loss, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense, at least to me. It's very difficult because grief is something that nobody wants to talk about. Death is something that nobody wants to talk about. And you really don't want to say the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. And I just sent a text to someone who lost someone. And even after sending the text, I was like, I hope this is what they want to hear or read right now. Mm-hmm. So it's okay you don't have to be perfect. There are some, I guess, some do's from what I'm hearing you say is hold the silence, hold the space. It's okay to not say anything at all. And we call it at experience camps just sitting in the mud. And you're just sitting in the mud with somebody in the disgusting mud and just listening or holding their hand or allowing them to cry.
Yeah.
And that's more powerful than you even know. And then some maybe don'ts is don't try to like diminish the pain or you'll get through it, because some people never get through it, and that's okay. You never get through grief or move past it. It's always with you, but you move forward with it with time.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. Two things. Uh, if if you try to accelerate the process of someone's grief, you may be, someone really needs to feel it. You really need to feel it. And there's so much bypassing that we can do because it's so painful. And like you said, it never 100% goes away. It morphs and changes over time. And the second thing is, I love the analogy of sitting in the mud, because that's exactly what it is. You're stuck. You're filthy. You can't get up. Something's over there, and you're just like, I can't move out of this. But if someone's sitting with you in the mud and you're there for months and months, they're going to trust you for when they're actually ready to stand up, and you can hold them up. Okay. And then I'm ready to walk a couple steps, and you can hold their hand. Okay. I'm ready to get the hose to, kind of to wash off. You can be that person, a couple months down the road when they, maybe you're sleeping a little bit better, have eaten a little bit better, memorial services is past them, they've picked up a little bit. So it's a process. So, I think if you're able to show that person that you can handle their grief and they can trust you with their grief, then they're going to be more likely to lean on you down the road. Too, because like you said, this is something that is going to be ongoing for a long time and forever.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think if you've never gone through it, you have no idea how it feels. And I think you're right. Like in general, to an extent, you don't know. Everybody's grief is different, which is why it's such a unique topic, because it's individual to the person. My grief with my dad is different from losing a child or losing a spouse, or somebody else losing their dad to a heart attack at the exact same age at the exact same time, because their relationship was different. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to have experienced a loss to be someone's grief companion. And so, Rachel, I wanted to thank you for the work that you do with the families, because you really are people's companion through grief during your work. And I think even not having directly experienced that specific loss, like you can still show up for the people in your lives that maybe have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm an example of that. I think, it takes practice, and it takes knowing your own level of comfortability with the topic. You will feel uncomfortable. You'll feel nervous. You won't want to do it. It's not like fun necessarily, but it's so meaningful for the individual and for the family. Yeah. And I think, it's going to happen to all of us. So for me, it's like, you learn these things and you can apply them. You'll be able to apply them multiple times over the course of one's life, because these things will come up for all of us. Sometimes families just cannot deal with the uncertainty at that moment. And I say, okay, well, we can revisit this down the road. And I just have to do very, very careful counseling about that aspect of uncertainty, that it could, it could muddy the waters in a way too. If we get an uncertain genetic variant, how do we then apply that to the family? But I assure them that that's not their job to do all the research about the genetic variant, that that's my job, my clinical team's job, so that, we do our best to guide the family. But uncertainty is, it's like the name of the game with a lot of genetic testing. We just
Yeah.
can find things a lot of times and have trouble interpreting them because we are still learning about all these genetic variants ourselves.
How has the testing and the technology progressed over time?
Really good question. It's changing constantly. So that's why I think it's important to talk to somebody that sort of knows the ins and outs. These things are very difficult to even research online. I shared with you some of the resources from the SADS Foundation. But so there are things, but a bereaved individual is going to have a hard time even opening up their email, let alone finding these very nuanced logistics about how to coordinate, genetic testing. So the technology has changed tremendously. It's at a point now, like I mentioned, we're able to kind of look at all of the coding regions of the gene and beyond. It's a test called whole genome sequencing, which is essentially kind of the top tier genetic test that we could do. Is the most comprehensive. Where our limitations lie, like I was alluding to, our ability to interpret the things that we find. So we may be able to run the test, but all of that data we get back, we need to be really thoughtful and careful about, because these results have implications for families. It's not just some test we're running. So that's why it helps to be at an academic institution where we can put all of our heads together and, try to sift through the data and make the best decision and call about what these genetics mean for the family, and then how we could apply it to the survivors and all of their relatives.
Yeah, because that's the big thing, is also the application. You have the data and now the application,
Exactly.
and how people's lives change.
Exactly. Yeah, that's and one of the conversations I'm having with my families now, because of our limited ability to interpret the data, is to revisit the data every 2 years, every 5 years. What's helpful is that if their family members, the survivors, are plugged into surveillance, they're seeing a cardiologist regularly, I'm always going to have access to those patients. So it's kind of like this feedback loop where they'll see the cardiologist. Hey, Rachel, this family you coordinated postmortem testing for 3 years ago, they're wondering if there's any new updates to the technology. Can we maybe revisit the decedent's data? Is there anything new that comes out? Yeah, it's that for me. The longitudinal relationship that I can have with families, and sort of that like full circle, is so helpful for me and so meaningful for families and so important, because of, I'm never going to say we know everything about genetics. That'd be the most ignorant thing to say. We don't. So, we really do need to keep checking things down the road. And we've done additional testing, not always in a decedent case, but with, some of my living patients with disease. And we've redone testing and then found the thing we wouldn't have found 10 years ago. So it's really important, to do what we call a reevaluation, genetic reevaluation.
Okay. So it's important to do the genetic reevaluation and revisit that data. What else do some of these families that have experienced a sudden death, sudden loss, what do they wish they would have known or maybe done differently beforehand?
I think, two things kind of come to mind. I think that, if they really want to do postmortem genetic testing, kind of knowing like the conversations that they need to have to be able to secure that samples could be used, because sometimes things are discarded and then you just can't get things back, or they get to me. And a lot of times samples aren't kept for more than a year, but it took them 14 months to get to me just because of the craziness of life. And, again, I'm very hard to find. So I would say that's probably one of the is some feedback I've gotten from families. And then I think the financial piece, honestly, I mean, families that just didn't have even the wishes of their loved one, known or have things in place to mitigate a situation of a sudden loss of a loved one. Because those two things are, can make such a difference following an event like this when you're not thinking straight and you just, kind of need things to be on track, on the rails, just to be able to function.
Yeah. And you've alluded to it a number of times, but the 14 months it takes for it to get to you, or extended time, or distractions, or the numbness of the brain that you get when you've experienced a loss and are going through the ebbs and flows of grief. Your number one job after someone dies should be to grieve. And there's so many different things that come up, that, which is why I created this podcast. I created the currency of grief is because to allow people to know that their number one job is to grieve, and maybe do some of these things in advance, or know that some of these resources are available. God forbid something like this happens to you or someone in your family. And I think also really just going to the doctor. Like, I think if my dad went to the doctor and went to the cardiologist and got the necessary tests, maybe we would have caught it, maybe we don't. But that thought process went through my head, and I'm sure for a lot of people it goes through theirs.
I couldn't agree more. I would say that a majority of the cases that I handle of adults that have passed suddenly are extremely healthy. Sometimes even, extreme athletes. They were not expecting something like this. And in those situations, many situations, it's hard to go to the doctor. It's hard to carve out that time. The appointments are spaced out. But I would say that, families do mention that. And so, I think, the sort of just having ducks in a row, just having things planned out, again, having those hard conversations, they're not fun. I've had those conversations with you, Justin, about what would happen in these extreme situations. And I think that's even how you figured out what I did when I explained, what I did. But, it really does help illuminate not only what you want, here and now, but if, God forbid, anything were to happen, at least you have that peace of mind of knowing that, you're sort of taking that burden off of your loved ones, because they're going to have to figure it out on their own. If you don't leave some sort of a structure for them to be able to navigate all this, which, like you said, your job is to grieve afterwards. And if you're having to figure out the wishes of your loved ones, it could be very, very difficult and sometimes tenuous, depending on the family dynamic, that you could avoid.
Mm. We're going to get a little, I guess, gory for a second, but when you talk about wishes of loved ones, people are able to indicate their wishes on, like, estate documents and wills and stuff like that. And so are there wishes that would preclude someone not to be able to have genetic testing done? For example, like cremation?
That is a great question. So typically, if somebody, does pass through a medical examiner or coroner's office, they can still, there's definitely different, ways that somebody, could be buried or preserved. If an autopsy happens, then they're able to hold a sample, and then the family, would be able to, to proceed with the burial wishes of their loved ones. But sometimes, if somebody is cremated, that we're not, and you wouldn't be able to go back and do any genetic testing. And so that's why that's a very important, thing that families aren't thinking of when they are going through something so sudden like that. And, I mentioned the physicality of, their loved one just not being in their control anymore. They don't have any autonomy over that necessarily, unless ahead of time. to get those samples and to hold them. And so
Yeah.
my families, some of them that happened to get to me and were able to do testing, they just had some awakening and they were really astute and motivated and were able to do it. But that is not the majority of people that are able to do that.
Hmm. Well, it went through my head. So if I think it, I'll say it. So I did, but I wanted to put that question in there. My last main question here for you: family experiences a sudden death
Mm-hmm.
of a parent or a young child. Do you have any words of wisdoms or grief mantras that you would tell them to guide their grief journey?
Yeah, I think it's something that we've, kind of been touching on this whole time, and it's to feel it, feel feel everything, especially in the beginning, because I think if you postpone the grief, it's going to just kind of well up and be even more intense and come at an even more inopportune time. There's something really, I think, hard too about the grief process is that, you get all the support in the beginning and then everyone's lives sort of carry on. And, you're 2 months out, you still feel horrible, like
The
you got hit
grief
by a
cliff.
train. Yep, exactly.
We know the
But
grief cliff well.
yep. And
So
so,
two
yeah,
months out.
yep, yep. 2 months out, people stop calling. You're maybe back at work and, you get some sympathy, empathy for a little bit, but, you're back on all of these projects. And so you're still going to have to process things, but I think, feel it, feel it, feel it. And uh, and it's not going to take anything away, like we've alluded to, but at least it'll help. I think just you'll kind of get to the bottom of a lot of it, identify what's there, and that'll in a way to free up your mind and your brain to be able to then take care of logistics and things like that. And if you've had a plan in place, then that's even better. Not everyone's going to, most don't. But yeah, and whatever anyone is feeling is valid. Like you said, everyone's grief journey, it's like a thumbprint. It's going to be so different for you. And I see that even within families where they've lost the same person, but again, their dynamic with that individual is so different. So because I work with the families and everyone's grieving and bereaved, you see how different things can be. And so whatever you're feeling, that's it's valid 100%.
So feel the feelings, and whatever you feel is valid. It's okay. Those
Mm-hmm.
emotions are okay. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to smile. It's okay to remember. It's okay to cry.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
And
all of the above.
don't postpone the grief. Feel the feelings up front so they don't
Mm-hmm.
kind of materialize in other ways throughout your
Mm-hmm.
life.
Yeah, yeah. Grief can fester. It can fester and it can morph into, you probably know this complex grief. Especially if things aren't addressed early on, can really become debilitating down the road. And your loved one doesn't want that for you either, and so they want you to keep living and keep going. So it's easier said than done, 100%. But yeah, but I would say that for me, at least, having kind of seen my families through this journey does help in the long run.
Hmm. And can families who have experienced this and are going through genetic testing, and can they be like, is there a community of families? Can they be connected to other families?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know SADS Foundation is a really good place for families to land. They're kind of the national organization for individuals that have been through an experience like this. And I shared the resource with Justin, so that should be available for people that want to access it. But like you said, it's still this kind of niche that's being carved out. It's not something that other than people that have gone through the experience really want to talk about. So I think that there's so much more to do in terms of connecting our families. I know we've shared about the camp that you volunteer at in the South. Like those types of spaces for our families are few and far between, but I think that we can do so much more to connect our families, especially because it is such a unique experience.
Yeah. And SAD stands for sudden arrhythmia death syndromes. And it sounds like they're a program and advocate for families who've experienced the sudden death, potentially of someone under the age of 40 or 45, as well as advancing care for people with heart arrhythmia conditions that can lead to sudden death. So I will link that resource in the show notes. Rachel, thank you so much. I know you're hard to find and hard to get to. Where can people find you?
So I am a clinician at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. So, and I can work with families within the state of California, am physically located in San Francisco. So, physically can see patients in the kind of Bay Area. So yeah, that's probably the best place to find me. And yeah, and if families do want to seek care, they could be seen within our hospital system.
Yeah,
And for families that are not within kind of my immediate jurisdiction, I do help other family members kind of connect to care in their local area.
that's great. I will. I'll link your bio as well to the show notes, just so people can read a little bit more about the work that you do.
Great.
But Rachel, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being an expert in genetic counseling, helping these families through the toughest time of their life, and being an amazing guest on the Currency of Grief podcast. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Justin. And I am so glad that we got to have this conversation and meet your podcast family too.
Thank you so much. So, podcast family, it's a great day to have a great day. So, go have a great day. See you next time.